Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to take a look at a premium Tier 5 Japanese light carrier, the Zuiho, in World of Warships Legends. For this review, we'll talk about the ship in-game before going into her stats in more depth, then finish off with some gameplay. If you want to skip around, there are time codes in the description, as well as a link to the Zuiho ship history video I made if you want to learn more about that. Zuiho was the first Tier 5 premium carrier released into Legends and is very much the other Japanese carrier, sitting alongside the Tier 5 Ryujo. Similar to how Ranger is good at dive bombers and Furious rains fire from the heavens, Independence is just that much little bit better at the dive bombing game, and Ark Royal hands out biblical levels of fire and brimstone. Zuiho does Ryujo things, aka torpedo bombers, just a bit better, and with exaggerated weaknesses. So in this case, Zuiho's advantages are pretty straightforward. Her torpedo bombers hit harder than any other carrier at the tier. She has the fastest torpedoes, and they drop 3x3 rather than in pairs. Scoring more hits with more damage is likely to promote more floods, so even if Zuiho's dive bombers are thoroughly unimpressive, they do enjoy a somewhat higher fire chance, which can lead to more damage over time against foes that have burnt their damage control consumables. Though no carrier is truly all that stealthy anymore, Zuiho is currently the least visible carrier at the tier, so hopefully that would allow you to move around without getting too much attention. Because if you do get some, things will go pretty poorly for you. Now, I will address that some of you are thinking the three descriptions here are pretty obvious for just about any carrier, but I put these descriptions here in comparison to other carriers. She has low hit points, destroyer levels of armor, probably the worst secondary battery of any Tier 5 carrier, at least among those that have one, and her AA is unlikely to dissuade people from attacking her. Also, if you're not careful, even having good stealth isn't going to be able to save you from taking a lot of damage, because she's also the slowest carrier at Tier 5. I'm not sure that being tied for that honor makes it feel any better. Unsurprisingly, folks who are going to enjoy playing Zuiho are probably the people who prefer the playstyle of the Ryujo, or possibly other German and Japanese carriers. But really, this ship is just Ryujo turned up to 11, both in terms of her strengths, but also in terms of those shortcomings. As we look at the stats of the Zuiho, her survivability is a laundry list of items you'd prefer not to see individually, much less together. You start with the lowest amount of HP of any carrier at the tier, just 36,500. That's 10% less than Ryujo, and you don't make up for that with improved armor in any way. The Zuiho does have an above the waterline exposed citadel that sits against the outside of the ship. All bad things. At 20mm, that does mean that she can get citadeled by just about everything shooting HE. This is technically thin enough that some battleship shells won't arm if you're poorly angled enough, but in no way does that constitute advice. But it also puts basically the whole ship into overmatch territory. Then, for the convenience of that hit model, you have 30mm on the bottom of the ship, just to make sure fewer bombs or shells go straight through the bottom of it. There's simply no world where this piece of armor is useful to you. You also have no torpedo bulge, so don't ask me where this 4% torpedo protection comes from. That technically makes you the second best protected carrier at the tier from torpedoes, but I wouldn't take a victory lap here after taking 96% of the damage from a torpedo. Zuiho's air group is definitely a case of min-maxing at the character creation stage, and by that I mean you have pretty awful dive bombers and excellent torpedo bombers, though in both cases they are a bit on the flimsy and slow side. Her dive bombers are Judy's. You start with 16 of them on deck, which is nice, but the restoration is pretty unimpressive. That will result in the lowest average number of dive bombers per match among carriers that play by the normal rules. They're about 10% less durable than other dive bombers at the tier, so count on losing quite a few of these. The only real good news here is that they are excellent fire starters, even if the bomb damage is totally average, which works out a bit differently than on Ryujo, that does more damage but has a lesser fire chance. And frankly, you'd probably prefer fires for that damage over time. One reason why you might prefer that is because you're probably going to set a decent number of floods. Zuiho's torpedo bombers are the iconic Kates, and while they are also a bit light on the HP, you start with 18 and they have more competitive restoration. So you actually end up with more of them than any other carrier at Tier 5 right now. They have the most damaging torpedoes by a pretty large margin, Ryujo, for instance, is in second place, and its torpedoes only do 7,200 damage. They also have a 55 knot top speed, and this may almost sound too good to be true. There are a few hidden stats here that are going to make this a bit harder to use though. One of these is the arming distance, which Zuiho is about 1,400 meters versus the 1,000 meters of Ryujo. You'll also notice that Zuiho is placing 3 torpedoes in the water at the same time. But what may not immediately jump out to you is that if you want to make a second attack run, that's 400 extra meters until you fly over your target, then an extra 400 meters you have to travel before even beginning to think about turning around. So that's an extra 800 meters of flying through your target's best AA. And then if you do get a second run in, it's probably an extra 400 meters where your planes will have to fly back through all of that. So basically, you're going to lose more planes, and that high speed doesn't actually compensate for having to drop 40% further away. Whether you think that's fair, or an interesting trade, or just OP is probably highly dependent on whether you're judging this as a battleship or a destroyer, and maybe equally so if you're trying to target those. You could try to launch from further away, and that will save you some of the worst of it, but 4.5 kilometer range on torps is just dead average, nothing great. The one thing you can say is that it is a not totally obvious trade-off for Zuiho being able to put upwards of 30,000 damage worth of torpedoes in the water at once, which is certainly a thing. Another thing you've obviously bartered away was your defenses. Zuiho has a weak secondary battery, which competes with Ranger for lowest DPM, but which also manages to have less range with just an unimpressive 4 kilometers. It's also made even more impressive when you consider that these are all dual-purpose guns, which means you've got a very weak AA suite coming in with just over 100 overall damage. This is only about a dozen damage per second lower than Ryujo, but that ship also puts more of its damage out at 5 kilometers. And the only nice thing that you can say is at least it is an Independence with its max range of just 3.5. But like the American premium carrier, what's going to do most of the work trying to keep enemy planes off this carrier is going to be its combat air patrol, because for Zuiho, the ship itself has pretty poor AA. Maneuverability for Zuiho is likewise not very great. Your 910 meter turning circle is right in the middle of the pack, and you have a decent rudder shift. The 28 knot speed is very slow, about 3 knots slower than average. But perhaps that's not surprising if you like Ryujo, which shares this same terrible top speed. The only other advantage Zuiho enjoys is a relatively low sea detectability. She's 400 meters less visible by sea than most carriers, and 200 by air. There's a colorable argument that this stat is more important the more small versions of maps are in the rotation, so like right now there's a positively annoying number of them, since carriers struggle not to get spotted within those tiny confines. And as we jump into some gameplay, we're going to be on Land of Fire. A little concerning because the astute player out there might notice that this doesn't play at tier 5 unless you're only playing on about a quarter of the map. And I'm talking about an area. You can do the math if you want to argue about what percentage of the map it is, but there's not much of it. And our carrier is almost at the border already. We take off with some torpedo bombers, and as we look at our commander, we're basically trying to do 3 things. We're trying to get a little bit more AA. It's not going to really help that much. We're doing a lot of stuff with torpedoes because this is primarily torpedo-based aircraft carrier. And then, of course, a little extra concealment never hurt anybody. So as you can see, we are just flying out over the middle of the map trying to get some spots. We have left some fighters to provide a little bit of cover for our destroyer down there. Not a bad idea. But as we're going in for our first attack, you can see the enemy carrier may have some different targeting priorities, namely us. That brings up an interesting question.
How do you shoot the devil in the back? What if you miss?
I would say just about the best way to get any carrier's attention is to attack him, particularly on a small map. And you know, sometimes there's a little bit of honor among thieves or carrier players, except for obviously the Soviets. They are up to no good all the time. In our case, I'm not sure if that's because of the fancy emblem or the CC in front of my name, or if this is just a normal tactical choice. Whatever the motivation, though, this is a small map, and I don't have an opportunity to run away, so I'm probably going to have to deal with that. Our hope there with our first set of torpedo bombers was maybe to hit it, maybe to burn the Ryujo's damage control party. If we can get that, then we know if we come back in a minute and we can land a second one, get a flood or a fire, that it will probably bleed out. At least it would have in the last update, but with the new flood mechanic, I'm not sure. Beyond that, though, Zuiho's torpedoes do a lot of damage on their own. So maybe this isn't a fight that you want. And all of that is a little bit academic. We were a couple steps away from that being a really operable plan. You can see we're going back and forth between our two types of aircraft. You can also see that I continue to adjust where my aircraft carrier is, just to make it a little bit harder to target. He's going to have to spend a little bit more time looking for me. And he's going to hopefully have a little bit harder time actually hitting me if I'm in the middle of a turn while doing that. Now you will note that I am kind of flying consistently one flight over one ship and then going on to a second. That is something I would say is not a terrible idea in Zuiho. This is going to help me maybe distribute the maximum amount of dots. That might be a good idea, but the reason why I'm doing it is just because that extra 400 meters that it takes me to fly to the target, fly past the target another 400 meters, and then turn around makes this sometimes a little bit awkward with pretty squishy planes. I don't particularly like giving people free XP, consolation XP, whatever you want to call shooting down planes these days. So, you know, I don't want to loiter in somebody's AA if I don't have to, much less multiple ships. Now we're coming back to try to apply another damage over time to Colorado. We get no love there. And we're on to Carrier, which we wouldn't mind just doing damage to. I don't think I have enough to actually kill him, but we get a good 4 hits. So he's on fire. Immediately puts it out because that's the automatic damage control. And at this point, it doesn't look like he has even enough hit points probably to survive one torpedo from us. Which is an excellent time to come back with some torpedo bombers. My guess is that those aircraft are going to probably come towards me, because if I were him, I would be pretty not happy with me. And I understand that. You know, the other thing, he might have just been doing the same thing that I am, which is flying past targets. Anyway. And though I don't know that carrier sniping is always a valid tactic, at this point, me getting this carrier off the board is me getting their most dynamic ship out of the game as well. We line up long. It looks like he is backing up, so we're going to play this as though he might change his speed. It looks like he took off with some aircraft in the interim. I'm not sure if that was his cap or if that was.
And like that, he's gone.
Another attack squadron. It looks probably like it was an attack squadron. And we get a little bit of indecision on where we want to move our carrier. I moved that south because I'm paying attention to B that is being capped. And if B is being capped, that means there's a destroyer here. And he's probably close to spotting me. That's the Moss. We've hit it a couple times before. And we're going to line up just a little bit outside and hope we get a lucky bomb hit. Pretty good there. Obviously, with any situation where you're trying to drop on a destroyer with just a couple of bombs, it's kind of hit or miss, so that could have gone pretty easily any other way. There's only one other way, I guess, that I miss. We fly our planes over towards Huga. You can see we hit the attack button with enough time to at least start the attack run before it hits 0. That's all that really matters. Apply a couple of dots to him, and that's going to be helpful because he has a stupid amount of armor and more hit points than he deserves. And I'm not saying the player, I'm saying the ship. And a whole bunch of other stuff that really makes Hugo, like, not the most fair ship in the game. In any case, it looks like he is having some fun dealing with someone else's torpedoes, so I'll save these for someone else. You can see we have full-strength California over there. My favorite thing to see, and basically full-strength New Orleans. Also not fantastic. The extra 400 meters to line up here is going to make it a little bit more difficult to actually land some hits. You can see he's turning out, so there are a couple things that screws me up with. I make my turn a little bit too soon. This probably would have worked with almost any carrier other than this, but that second drop is pretty terrible, and the only good thing about it is that hopefully it makes him turn back towards the middle of the map rather than spotting me, because he's getting pretty close to spotting me. We will return with some dive bombers. You can see we are getting a little bit deplaned here. And that's probably only going to get worse if we have to participate much with a California. Flying against California in Zuiho is particularly not fun. You will lose so many aircraft. And I'm just going over here to see if I can't apply a dot. I know I'm going to lose all 3 of these. And it looks like our battleship manages to take out the New Orleans, so this wasn't a terrible idea. He probably didn't have a good shot on California. We don't do a whole lot of anything against that. I didn't even see that we took out any AA, which would be nice, because it's got enough. So we're heading back over there. I expect that we will probably pre-drop. There you go. I'm not going to take this all the way down to 3 because I want to be able to launch 3 torpedoes, and I'm going to lose at least 1 or 2 planes by the time I can even launch. And I figure if I get 3 back with the replenishment, I ought to have at least 4 for the next run, maybe more. So we're playing the attrition game at this point. California is headed into the smoke screen. It's not very fast, so this should be a relatively easy target to hit with torpedoes, but he's doing a good job dodging somebody else's, and we land just the 1. I would say all in all, he's probably pretty happy with that outcome, but you can also see me hanging on there just to watch the torpedoes come in. That is a bad habit of a person who likes to make videos. It is not a good habit to get into. Cool guys don't look at explosions, and good carrier players don't feel the need to watch their torpedoes hit or not, which I realize is a somewhat less common phrase. But if you're in a destroyer, you can do it, and I'm sure he saw all of those good hits there at the end to take out the California, and that brings us to the end of the game. And of course, my closing thoughts on Zuiho. I'd rather play this ship than Ryujo. If I wanted to play a torpedo-based carrier personally, I think I'd prefer a German carrier or possibly Saipan. But Zuiho isn't bad, and the way it throws aircraft away is at least vaguely reminiscent of how Kaga plays. Similar to the Tier 7 premium carrier, I guess this might not be your favorite ship either if you're particularly afraid of handing out clear skies to your enemies. But I think we all did learn something here today. Each action has a not always equal and opposite reaction. Wherever you fall on the subject of carrier sniping, Zuiho is probably one of the better ones out there just based on damage alone. But I'm not saying Zuiho players are generally out there looking to cause trouble, unlike those Soviets. In any case, you'll rarely see me in this ship. That's just because I prefer to have good dive bombers most of the time. That's just my preference. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and as always, I hope to see you on the next one.